I want a divorce. The words came through the speaker of my phone with a flat, clinical precision that completely erased 12 years of shared history in less than 2 seconds. I stood in the center of our custom kitchen in Buckhead, the morning sun pouring across the marble countertops, and listened to the hollow silence that followed his declaration. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island. "Andre, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the vast empty space of our home. "You just left for the office an hour ago. You kissed my forehead. You asked me to pick up the dry cleaning." "I am done, Jada," he said, the arrogant lilt returning to his tone, the exact condescending pitch he reserved for contractors who missed deadlines and waitstaff who got his order wrong. "I have outgrown this life. I have outgrown you. I am building a real estate empire across Atlanta, and I cannot be tied down to a small-time forensic accountant who brings absolutely nothing to the table." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his words, a sound echoed in the background of his call. It was a distinct, high-pitched laugh. It belonged to Chloe, his white stepsister. Chloe was the family golden child, a woman who had spent the last decade rolling her eyes at my natural hair, my modest wardrobe, and my predictably boring career. My parents-in-law had always treated her failed luxury boutiques as brilliant entrepreneurial ventures while treating my demanding corporate accounting job as a cute little hobby. "Did Chloe pick out your script for you? Or did you write that pathetic speech yourself?" I asked, my tone dropping its warmth and replacing it with a dangerous calm. "Do not start with me." Andre snapped, his defensive anger flaring instantly. "I am not discussing this with you. I have already retained counsel. You can only speak to my lawyer from now on. Do not call my phone again. We are finished." The line went dead with a sharp click. I stood there in the silent kitchen for a long time. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not collapse onto the imported hardwood floors that I had picked out and quietly paid for. Instead, a cold, heavy realization settled into my bones. For 12 years, I had shrunk myself to protect his pride. As an African-American woman moving through the brutal corporate world of Atlanta, I knew how hard society tried to tear Black men down. I wanted Andre to feel like a king in his own home. When his first real estate venture nearly went bankrupt 6 years ago, I used my skills as a forensic accountant to trace his missing funds, restructure his debt, and quietly inject millions of my own hidden capital into his holding company through a private investment trust. I let him believe he was a self-made genius. I let him believe his sheer brilliance had saved his company. I handed him an empire and allowed him to wear the crown. And now he was using the very power I gave him to discard me. I walked slowly through the house, moving past the framed photographs of our smiling faces on vacations I had secretly subsidized. I bypassed the living room and headed straight down the hallway to my home office. The room was understated, simple, and practical, much like the persona I had maintained for my husband. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I moved to the large oak bookcase against the far wall. Pushing a specific volume aside, I triggered the hidden latch. The heavy shelf swung open smoothly, revealing a combination safe embedded directly into the reinforced steel of the foundation. I punched in the 12-digit alphanumeric code. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid, satisfying thud. Inside the safe, there were no stacks of cash or dramatic bundles of diamonds. There was only a sleek, heavily encrypted black flash drive and a stack of redacted legal documents. I reached in and pulled out the drive, holding the cold metal in the palm of my hand. This drive contained the true financial architecture of my entire life. It held the ledgers, the holding structures, the investment records, and the documents proving that JV Holdings, the faceless corporate entity behind everything Andre claimed to have built, was ultimately controlled through a private trust for which I was the sole beneficial owner. I slipped the drive into the inner pocket of my trench coat. I walked back out to the kitchen island and looked at the stack of mail Andre had left behind that morning. Sitting right on top, deliberately placed where I could not miss it, was a thick, embossed envelope. The return address was printed in sharp, aggressive lettering. Sterling and Associates. It was Atlanta's most vicious corporate law firm, known for utterly destroying opposing parties in high-asset divorces. Andre thought he was stepping on a quiet, docile wife who would simply roll over and accept whatever scraps he threw her way. He thought he was the apex predator in this city. He had absolutely no idea that for the past 10 years I had not just been crunching numbers at a desk. I had been quietly buying up the very ground he walked on. The gray sedan hummed quietly as I pulled out of the driveway of the Buckhead mansion I had technically paid for twice. I steered onto Peachtree Street, blending perfectly into the morning traffic. Andre always hated this car. He called it an embarrassment to his brand. He drove a customized matte black Range Rover that guzzled premium gas and demanded attention from everyone on the road. He told his friends my boring sedan was a testament to my lack of vision. He said I was just a simple forensic accountant who liked playing it safe. What Andre never understood was that wealth whispers while debt screams. I thought about his stepsister Chloe as I sat at a red light. Chloe with her endless string of failed luxury boutiques. Last year, she opened a high-end yoga studio that went under in 6 months. Andre bailed her out using company funds he thought were his own profits. He had no idea those profits were carefully orchestrated dividends I filtered into his accounts through my shadow company just to keep his fragile ego intact. I had spent a decade building a fortress around a man made of glass. Today I was taking a hammer to the walls. The glass and steel tower of Sterling and Associates loomed ahead. It was one of those aggressively modern structures designed to make you feel small before you even walked through the revolving doors. I pulled into the underground parking garage, bypassing the VIP section where Andre usually parked his Rover. I found a standard visitor spot and turned off the engine. I sat in the silence for a moment, feeling the cool weight of the encrypted flash drive in my trench coat pocket. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the main lobby. The space was a monument to corporate intimidation. White marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and cold, abstract art dominated the room. It was deliberately meant to break the spirit of anyone walking in for a hostile deposition. I approached the massive reception desk carved from a single block of black granite. The woman sitting behind it did not look up immediately. She was young, wearing a tailored designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and even. "I am here to see Victor Sterling." The receptionist finally looked up. Her eyes swept over my practical trench coat and sensible shoes. I could see the calculation happening in real time. She saw a black woman without a designer handbag and immediately filed me under insignificant. "I am sorry," she said, using a tone dripping with practiced corporate condescension. "Deliveries and couriers need to use the service elevator around the back of the building." "I am not a courier," I replied, keeping my posture relaxed. "My name is Jada Vaughn. I am Andre Vaughn's wife." The condescension in her eyes instantly morphed into pity. The shift was almost worse than the insult. She recognized the name immediately. In her mind, I was just another discarded spouse, the soon-to-be ex-wife summoned to sign away her life for pennies on the dollar. "Mr. Sterling is very busy today, Mrs. Vaughn," she said, adjusting her headset. "You do not have an appointment on the schedule." Usually, discarded spouses meet with our junior associates on the 3rd floor to handle the preliminary paperwork. "I am not meeting with a junior associate," I said. "Call up to the corner office. Tell Victor that I am here." She let out a sharp sigh of annoyance, resting her manicured hands on the desk. "I cannot just interrupt the managing partner because you decided to drop by. We have protocols. If you want to leave a message, I can take it. Otherwise, I am going to have to ask you to step aside so I can assist actual clients." 2 junior lawyers walking across the lobby slowed their pace to watch the interaction. They wore matching smug expressions, whispering to each other behind their coffee cups. They clearly recognized me as the opposition. The poor, clueless wife, trying to fight a losing battle against the great Victor Sterling. Their quiet laughter echoed off the marble walls, grating against the silent lobby. I did not break eye contact with the receptionist. "Pick up the phone," I instructed softly. Instead of picking up the phone, she caught the eye of a large security guard stationed by the elevator banks. He was a tall, imposing man, whose uniform bore the gold shield of Vanguard Security Services. He marched over, his hand resting heavily on his utility belt, clearly eager to flex his authority in front of the junior lawyers. "Is there a problem here, Sarah?" he asked, standing uncomfortably close to me, attempting to use his physical bulk to force me to retreat. "This woman is refusing to leave the desk," the receptionist said, crossing her arms defensively. "She is demanding to see Mr. Sterling without an appointment, and she will not step aside." The guard puffed out his chest, looking down at me. "All right, Ma, it is time for you to leave. Do not make me physically escort you out of the building. We do not want any trouble here." I slowly turned to face him. I did not step back. I looked directly at the badge pinned to his chest, reading the employee identification number stamped into the metal. "Your name is Officer Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute authority. "You work for Vanguard Security Services. You hold the primary security contract for this entire corporate plaza." He frowned, his aggressive stance faltering slightly. "How do you know that?" "Because Vanguard Security Services renewed their contract 3 months ago," I explained smoothly. "The contract was negotiated, approved, and signed by the Property Management Group. That group is a direct subsidiary of JV Holdings. Do you know who owns JV Holdings, Officer Miller?" He stared at me, the color slowly draining from his face as the realization began to sink in. "I own it," I said, stepping half an inch closer. "I own the management group, and a JV Holdings property subsidiary owns this building. And I hold the power to terminate Vanguard's security contract with a single phone call for breach of conduct. Now I am going to ask you a very simple question. Are you going to put your hands on the owner of this building, or are you going to step back and return to your post?" Officer Miller swallowed hard. He looked at the receptionist, then back at me. The bravado completely vanished from his eyes. He took 2 large steps backward, raising his hands in a gesture of complete surrender. "Have a good day, Ma, he said, his voice shaking slightly before he turned and walked quickly back to the elevator banks, keeping his head down. I turned my attention back to the receptionist. Her mouth was slightly open, her previous arrogance entirely gone, replaced by a deer-in-headlights stare. "Pick up the phone," I commanded. She grabbed the receiver so fast she nearly knocked over her coffee mug. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the direct line to the penthouse suite. "Mr. Sterling," she stammered into the receiver, her voice high and tight with panic. "I am so sorry to interrupt your morning. Mrs. Jada Vaughn is in the lobby. She insists on seeing you right now, and the security team will not remove her." There was a brief, agonizing pause as she listened to the response from the other end. She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." She put the phone down and gestured toward the private executive elevators with a shaking hand. "He will see you now. Top floor. The double mahogany doors at the very end of the hall." "Thank you, Sarah," I said politely, smoothing the lapels of my trench coat. I walked past the reception desk. The 2 junior lawyers who had been laughing earlier quickly looked away, suddenly finding their Italian leather shoes extremely fascinating. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. The doors slid shut, sealing me in the quiet mahogany-paneled car. As the elevator shot upward, my mind was perfectly clear. Andre wanted to play a game of power. He wanted to use his wealth and his expensive legal team to crush me into submission, to make me feel as small and insignificant as Chloe had always claimed I was. He wanted to leave me with nothing but a pathetic settlement check while he walked away with an empire I had secretly financed. He thought because I stayed quiet at family dinners, because I let him take the spotlight, that I was weak. The elevator chimed softly, announcing my arrival at the top floor. The doors parted, revealing a plush executive corridor bathed in natural light. I stepped out, my heels sinking into the thick, expensive carpet. The air up here smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne. I walked past the executive assistants, who dared not make eye contact, their fingers flying nervously across their keyboards. I marched straight toward the massive double mahogany doors at the very end of the hallway. I did not knock. I placed both hands on the heavy brass handles and pushed the doors wide open, stepping into the lion's den, ready to dismantle the illusion my husband called a life. The corner office was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed to strip visiting opponents of their confidence the moment they crossed the threshold. The far wall was made entirely of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a sweeping, unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline. It forced anyone standing in the room to stare out at the towering monuments of corporate wealth, while the man behind the desk remained backlit, shadowed, and imposing. The temperature in the room was deliberately kept a few degrees colder than the hallway. The guest chairs, positioned across from the massive polished mahogany desk, had their front legs shaved down by half an inch, creating a subtle downward tilt that forced the occupant to constantly brace themselves from sliding forward. Every single architectural choice was calculated to make you feel small off balance and entirely at the mercy of the managing partner. Victor Sterling fit perfectly into this carefully engineered environment. He sat perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. His silver hair was slicked back with absolute precision, and his sharp gray eyes evaluated me with a cold mechanical detachment. He did not stand when I walked in. He did not offer his hand for a greeting. He simply leaned back, steepling his manicured fingers together, and offered a tight, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked at my practical trench coat and my sensible block heels. I watched his gaze sweep over my natural hair tied back in a neat professional bun. I could read the calculations running behind his eyes with absolute clarity. He saw a middle-class African-American woman, a mere bookkeeper, who had been carried along by her wealthy, brilliant husband. He saw a discarded wife who was completely out of her depth in a room where millions of dollars were moved with a single signature. He assumed I was walking into his office seeking mercy. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with practiced condescension. "Please have a seat. I appreciate you coming down here in person. It shows a certain level of pragmatism that will serve you well today. I know these situations can be highly emotional, but I prefer to make things quick and efficient to save us both unnecessary distress." I walked slowly across the plush custom carpet. My footsteps made no sound in the cavernous room. I approached the two rigid guest chairs, sitting perfectly parallel to his desk. I did not sit down. I simply came to a stop behind the right chair, resting my hands lightly on the top of the leather backrest. By remaining standing, I forced him to physically tilt his chin upward to maintain eye contact, shifting the physical dynamic he had so carefully arranged. "I prefer to stand, Victor," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of inflection. "You mentioned efficiency. I value my time highly. Please proceed." A brief flash of irritation crossed his features, quickly masked by a patronizing chuckle. He clearly did not like being addressed by his first name by someone he considered a subordinate player in this divorce. He leaned forward, picking up a silver fountain pen, and tapped it against the rim of a crystal water glass. "Very well," he said, picking up a thin manila folder from the pristine surface of his desk. He slid it exactly halfway across the mahogany wood, forcing me to reach for it if I wanted to open it. I did not move my hands from the chair. "Your husband is a very successful man, Mrs. Vaughn." Victor continued, his tone shifting into the rhythmic cadence of a practiced litigator. "Andre has built a highly leveraged and highly visible real estate portfolio across this city. As I am sure you are aware, given your background in basic accounting, his assets are tied up in corporate structures, trusts, and operational capital. The illusion of his personal wealth is quite different from his actual liquid reality. Because you signed a standard prenuptial agreement 12 years ago, your claim to the business assets he developed during your marriage is severely limited." He paused, expecting me to argue or demand a fair share. I simply stared at him, my expression perfectly blank, waiting for him to dig his grave deeper. I knew exactly how tied up those assets were because I was the one who tied them up. I had spent countless nights designing those exact corporate structures to shield Andre from his own reckless spending habits. Victor was proudly explaining my own financial architecture to me, using it as a weapon, while failing to realize he was speaking to the architect herself. Victor cleared his throat slightly, unnerved by the heavy silence. "Andre is, however, an incredibly generous man. He wants to ensure you are not left entirely destitute as you transition into this next chapter of your life. Therefore, he has authorized me to offer you a flat $30,000 settlement. This amount will be paid in one lump sum upon the signing of this dissolution agreement. It is more than enough for you to secure a new apartment and cover your living expenses while you look for more permanent employment." $30,000. After 12 years of marriage, after building the very foundation his entire life stood upon, my husband believed my silence and compliance could be bought for $30,000. It was an intentional, deeply calculated insult. And the house, I asked, my voice betraying absolutely no emotion. "Oh, yes, the Buckhead property," Victor said, leaning back and steepling his fingers once again. "The settlement requires you to sign over all of your equity and claim to the marital home. The deed will be transferred entirely out of your name. Andre has decided that the property will be gifted directly to his sister Chloe. She requires a stable asset for her boutique business ventures, and Andre feels it is his duty to provide for his immediate family. In exchange for your full cooperation with this property transfer, Andre will graciously agree not to pursue any portion of your personal retirement accounts or your modest checking balances." The audacity of the demand was breathtaking. Andre was not just kicking me out of the home I had paid the mortgage on through anonymous corporate channels. He was literally handing the keys to Chloe, the white stepsister, who had spent a decade mocking my career, my appearance, and my presence in the family. Chloe, who could not keep a luxury yoga studio open for more than 6 months without requiring a massive financial bailout. Andre was using my divorce to fund his sister's vanity projects. Victor leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk, his tone dropping into a harsh, intimidating register designed to crush any lingering resistance. "I highly suggest you take this offer, Mrs. Vaughn. I know it might feel unfair to you, but I assure you this is the best scenario you will get. If you refuse to sign these papers today, Andre is prepared to withdraw this generous offer completely. We will drag this divorce out in court for years. We will tie up your meager assets in endless litigation. You do not have the capital to fight a firm like Sterling and Associates. We will bury you in legal fees until you are forced to declare bankruptcy. Take the $30,000. Walk away quietly and start over. It is the only sensible choice you have." He picked up his expensive Mont Blanc pen and held it out toward me, expecting me to step forward, take the pen and sign away my life with tears in my eyes. I looked at the silver pen gleaming in the sunlight. I looked at the thin, insulting settlement folder resting on the mahogany desk. I looked at Victor Sterling, a man who made millions of dollars bullying vulnerable spouses into financial ruin. My mind processed the room exactly as it processed a corrupt corporate ledger. I saw every hidden liability, every false asset, every arrogant miscalculation. Victor assumed I was an uneducated adversary because I had allowed my husband to play the role of the financial genius. He assumed my silence was born of fear. I had no idea my silence was simply the process of gathering forensic evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mention the 12 years of absolute loyalty I had given to a man who discarded me over a 30-second phone call. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my trench coat. My fingers bypassed the encrypted flash drive and closed around a single sheet of thick watermarked paper folded precisely in half. I pulled it out, unfolding it with slow, deliberate movements. I stepped out from behind the guest chair. I walked directly up to the edge of his massive desk, invading the physical barrier he used to keep clients at bay. I held the document in my right hand. It was a heavily redacted financial disclosure form, stamped with the seal of a federal banking institution. I extended my arm and slid the thick paper directly over the top of his insulting manila folder, completely covering the $30,000 settlement offer. Mr. Sterling let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, rolling his eyes as he pulled his hand back. "Mrs. Vaughn, presenting me with your personal bookkeeping records will not change the reality of your situation. You can show me all the joint bank statements you want. The law is very clear on these matters, and your husband is protected by a corporate structure that your small-time accounting skills cannot penetrate." He stopped speaking mid-sentence. His sharp gray eyes had finally focused on the heavy watermarked document lying directly in front of him. His arrogant smirk vanished from his face as if it had been physically erased. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing deeply, as his eyes darted across the black, redacted blocks. The routing codes, the institutional seals, and the single unredacted signature line at the very bottom. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. "Read the name of the holding company that owns the lease to this very building." "Victor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register. "Then read the name of the primary backer who funded your law firm's massive interstate expansion last quarter. and finally read the name of the anonymous majority shareholder who owns every single asset, property, and corporate account in Andre Vaughn's entire real estate portfolio. Sterling lifted his hands from the desk, but they were shaking so violently he could not control them. The expensive Mont Blanc pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood floor, rolling away into the shadows. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Yes, I smiled, leaning my weight onto my hands so my face was just inches from his. I am the wife. Now sit down, Victor. You and I are going to draft a completely new settlement. Victor fell back into his chair as if the strength in his legs had simply evaporated. The heavy leather creaked loudly in the dead silence of the room. His mouth opened and closed a few times, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. I watched the arrogant managing partner of Atlanta's most feared corporate law firm completely unravel before my eyes. The transformation was profound and deeply satisfying. The man who had just threatened to bury me in legal fees was now hyperventilating, looking at the watermarked document like it was a live explosive. I pulled the right guest chair back, the one with the shaved-down legs, and sat down smoothly. I crossed my legs, keeping my posture impeccably straight. I did not slide forward. I anchored myself, claiming the space. I looked at the pathetic $30,000 settlement folder he had offered me. I picked it up and dropped it into the polished stainless steel trash bin next to his desk. It landed with a dull thud that made Victor physically jump. Mrs. Vaughn, he finally stammered, his voice completely stripped of its practiced baritone. Jada. Please understand, we had no idea. Your husband presented himself as the sole equity owner. The blind trust the holding companies. It is completely unprecedented for a spouse to operate a shadow corporation of this magnitude without the primary beneficiary knowing. I raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. You do not get to speak yet, Victor. You are going to listen. For 12 years, I built Andre from the ground up. He had the charisma and the connections, but he lacked the discipline and the capital. I provided both. When he decided to outgrow me, he came to you to do his dirty work. You did not do your due diligence. You looked at an African-American woman with a neat bun and a simple trench coat and assumed I was prey. You assumed wrong. I am the predator in this ecosystem. Victor swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. His sharp gray eyes darted around the room as if searching for an exit. I stood back up and began to pace slowly around his massive office. I ran my fingers lightly over the polished wood of his bookshelves. I paused to examine a framed degree from Harvard Law hanging proudly on the wall. I do not just crunch numbers, Victor, I said, keeping my back to him as I studied the expensive frame. I am a forensic accountant. I dismantle financial illusions for a living. The moment Andre carelessly left your firm's embossed envelope on my kitchen counter this morning, I ran a full diagnostic on Sterling and Associates. I know that your senior partners are actively looking for an excuse to force you into early retirement. I know your billable hours have been artificially inflated for the past 3 quarters to hide a slump in your personal client acquisition. I know exactly how precarious your position is in this firm. You rely on heavy-hitting clients like Andre to maintain your status and justify your exorbitant draw. But Andre is a phantom. I am the bank. I turned around to face him. I pointed to the heavy watermark document still resting on his desk. JV Holdings acquired the commercial real estate debt for this very building 18 months ago. We also hold the primary mezzanine loan your firm took out to fund your expansion into Charlotte and Miami. There is a specific covenant in that loan agreement, a morality clause combined with a key investor recall option. I can legally demand full repayment of that expansion capital within 48 hours. Do you have $12 million in liquid cash sitting in your firm's operating account today, Victor? No, ma'am, we do not, he whispered. He looked physically ill. His immaculate posture was gone. He was slouching, his shoulders curled inward defensively. Then we have a serious conflict, Victor, I said, stepping directly in front of his desk. You came into this meeting believing Andre controlled assets that are actually tied to entities I own. Now that you understand the real ownership structure, You cannot ethically continue pretending this is a simple high-asset divorce where he holds all the leverage. Victor swallowed hard. I cannot represent both sides, he said quietly. I am not asking you to. I leaned forward, resting both hands against the edge of his desk. You are going to do the one thing your professional obligations actually require. You are going to withdraw from representing Andre in any matter where this financial conflict makes your continued representation impossible. You will not disclose my confidential ownership documents beyond what the law requires, and you will not fabricate a story for him either. Victor stared at me, trying to understand where the trap was. Then how do you plan to keep him from discovering the truth before Friday? I smiled. Andre does not need your help to remain arrogant. He has spent 12 years underestimating me without any assistance from you. I straightened my coat. He already demanded that I sign his settlement by Friday. He already believes the Buckhead house belongs to him. He already believes Vanguard is his empire. All you need to do is formally withdraw and let him continue making decisions based on the assumptions he created for himself. Victor exhaled slowly. And Sterling and Associates. That is a separate business relationship, I said. JV Holdings will enforce every legitimate covenant connected to your firm's financing exactly according to the contracts. I will not ask you to violate attorney-client duties, and you will not ask me to ignore contractual rights simply because you underestimated who was sitting across from you. For the first time since I entered his office, Victor looked less terrified than stunned. You planned for every angle. No, Victor, I said. I simply read the paperwork before I sign it. Good, I said, standing tall and smoothing the front of my trench coat. I reached over the desk to retrieve my heavily redacted document. I folded it neatly and placed it back into my inner pocket, securing the financial weapon against my chest. I turned toward the double mahogany doors. Oh, and Victor, I said, pausing with my hand on the brass doorknob. Do not ever try to shave down the legs of a guest chair again. It is incredibly tacky, and it only works on people who do not know how to stand on their own 2 feet. I opened the heavy doors and walked out of the corner office. The executive assistants outside quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their computer screens. I walked to the private elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and waited. The descent felt entirely different than the ride up. I had entered the building as a discarded wife bracing for a grueling legal battle. I was leaving as the undisputed owner of the chessboard. Andre had fired the first shot, thinking the war was already won. He was about to find out that the game had not even begun. As the elevator doors slid open into the main lobby, I walked past the reception desk with my head held high, stepping out into the bright Atlanta sun ready for the mediation dinner. The warm Atlanta evening air felt entirely different now. It carried the scent of blooming magnolia and expensive exhaust fumes from the valet lane outside Chop's Lobster Bar. This was Andre's favorite place to be seen. He loved the dark mahogany walls, the dim lighting, and the obsequious waitstaff, who knew him by name. He thought bringing me here to his home turf would automatically put me at a disadvantage. I handed my keys to the valet and smoothed the skirt of my navy blue dress. I did not wear the designer labels Chloe obsessed over. I wore tailoring that commanded respect without screaming for attention. I walked through the heavy glass doors and let the hostess guide me to the private dining alcove Andre had reserved. I was already seated at the center of a circular leather booth. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit, his gold watch catching the ambient light. Sitting immediately to his right, nursing a flute of vintage champagne, was Chloe. Her blonde hair was blown out to absolute perfection, and she wore an arrogant smile that instantly transported me back through a decade of miserable family holidays. I took the seat directly across from them, placing my purse neatly on the empty chair beside me. Andre did not stand when I arrived. He merely took a sip of his bourbon and stared at me with cold calculation. Jada. Andre said, his voice loud enough to assert dominance, but low enough to avoid drawing stares from the adjacent tables. I heard you stormed into Victor's office on Tuesday. Then he suddenly withdrew from my case because of some supposed conflict. I assume that was another one of your little accounting tricks. I looked at him and immediately understood that Victor had kept his professional obligations exactly as promised. Andre still had no idea what the conflict actually was. His own arrogance had filled in the blanks for him. I am perfectly calm, Andre, I replied, keeping my tone flat and unreadable. I am here to listen to what you have to say. Chloe let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. Her laughter was a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the sophisticated ambiance of the restaurant. It was a sound I had endured during every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner for over a decade. The family always laughed right along with her, treating her thinly veiled insults as brilliant, witty observations. Andre had always permitted her behavior, refusing to ever draw a firm boundary to protect his wife. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth. Honestly, Jada, you should be thanking us, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Andre is being incredibly generous. $30,000 is a lot of money for someone on a bookkeeper's salary. You could put a down payment on a cute little condo out in the suburbs, somewhere quiet, somewhere that fits your whole plain, boring career and aesthetic. I looked at Chloe. I remembered the exact afternoon 3 years ago when Andre begged me to help him cover up the massive losses from her second failed luxury boutique. She had tried to import high-end European skincare, but spent the entire operational budget on launch parties and personal trips to Paris. I had spent 4 days restructuring his holding accounts to hide the hemorrhage of cash, masking it as a strategic tax write-off. She sat there sipping champagne I technically bought for her, mocking the very career that kept her out of federal bankruptcy court. My aesthetic is perfectly fine, Chloe, I said evenly, but we are not here to discuss my wardrobe, we are here to discuss the settlement. Andre leaned forward, mirroring Chloe's aggressive posture. He pulled a fresh copy of the settlement folder from his briefcase and placed it squarely in the middle of the table. There is nothing to discuss, Jada, he said. This is the offer. It is a gift. You know as well as I do that I built this real estate company from the dirt up. I spent the last 10 years sweating, negotiating, and risking everything to put my name on the Atlanta skyline. I am a self-made man. My family supported my vision. Chloe supported my vision. You just sat in the background punching numbers into a calculator. I kept my expression entirely neutral. A self-made man. He truly believed his own mythology. He actually believed that the multi-million-dollar capital injections that saved his first 3 commercial projects came from anonymous angel investors who just happened to recognize his sheer brilliance. He never once questioned why those investors never demanded a board seat. He never questioned the impossibly favorable interest rates. He just accepted the money and crowned himself a king. I supported your vision, Andre, I said softly, allowing just enough vulnerability into my voice to make him feel powerful. I managed the household. I kept our personal finances stable while you took those risks. Keeping the lights on is not building an empire, he scoffed. Anyone can balance a checkbook. It takes real talent to build generational wealth. Look at Chloe. She takes risks. She has an entrepreneurial spirit. She understands what it means to build a luxury brand. I looked at the entrepreneurial spirit sitting next to him. Chloe smiled brightly, raising her champagne flute in a silent toast to her own imaginary brilliance. That is why I am giving her the Buckhead house, Andre continued, tapping his finger on the settlement folder. She needs a proper space to host her new clients and establish her brand. You never liked hosting anyway, Jada. You always preferred to sit in the corner and avoid making connections. It is just your nature. You do not belong in that house anymore. You do not fit the lifestyle I have created. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The sheer volume of their delusion was fascinating to witness in real time. They were 2 people standing on a trapdoor bragging about how tall they were. So you want me to walk away with $30,000 and leave you with the business, the liquid assets, and the house, I summarized, keeping my voice devoid of anger. I want you to sign the papers tonight, Andre corrected, his tone hardening into a direct command. You do not have leverage here, Jada. I own the business. The house is held in a corporate trust that you cannot touch. I have the best legal team in the state of Georgia. If you try to fight me, I will drag this out until your meager savings are completely gone. He leaned back, gesturing to the waiter to bring the check for their drinks. He clearly had no intention of actually eating dinner with me. This was an ambush designed to intimidate me into a quick surrender. You need to understand your position, Jada. Chloe added, her tone shifting from sweet to venomous. You were lucky Andre kept you around this long. You never fit in with us. You are just a boring, plain number cruncher. Take the money and go back to your quiet little life before he changes his mind and leaves you with absolutely nothing. I looked at the settlement folder resting on the white tablecloth. I thought about the encrypted flash drive locked safely in my home safe. I thought about Victor Sterling shaking in his corner office after finally realizing the financial structure Andre had never bothered to understand. Andre thought he had cornered a mouse. He did not realize he was staring directly into the gaping jaws of a lion. I will need a few days to review these documents with independent counsel, I said, picking up the folder and sliding it into my purse. I cannot just sign away 12 years of marriage over a glass of ice water. Andre slammed his hand onto the table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly. The facade of the generous provider vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless bully I had shielded from the world for a decade. You do not get to dictate terms to me, he hissed, his voice low and vibrating with intense malice. You will not waste my time consulting with some bargain bin lawyer you found in a strip mall. I am giving you a strict deadline, Jada. You have until this Friday at 5 in the afternoon to return those signed papers to me. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. And if I do not sign them by Friday, I asked, looking down at him. Andre smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. If you do not sign them by Friday, I will withdraw the $30,000. I will lock you out of the joint checking accounts. I will have the corporate trust evict you from the Buckhead house by Monday morning. I will make sure you walk away from this marriage with absolutely zero. You will be back to living in a cramped apartment balancing checkbooks for pennies. Do not test me, Jada. I hold all the cards here. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his face. I noted the way Chloe crossed her arms, nodding in full agreement with his aggressive threat. They were completely united in their desire to see me entirely broken. The waiter approached our table holding a silver tray with their check. Andre pulled out his sleek, metallic credit card. The card was linked directly to a secondary expense account. It was an account I had personally authorized and funded. I watched him hand my money to the waiter to pay for the champagne they drank while plotting my ruin. You are making a massive mistake, Andre, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried perfectly across the small table. He laughed, an ugly, dismissive sound. The only mistake I made was marrying someone who lacks the capacity to grow. I am entering a new stratosphere of wealth, Jada. I need a partner who understands power, not someone who shrinks in the face of it. Friday at 5. Bring the signed papers or face the severe consequences. Chloe smirked, taking a final sip from her tall glass. Do not forget to clear your cheap clothes out of the master closet by the weekend, Jada. I have professional contractors coming on Monday to measure the space. I am turning your side of the room into a massive shoe gallery. I did not respond to her petty provocation. I simply looked at Andre, committing the absolute arrogance in his eyes to memory. I wanted to remember exactly how he looked in this precise moment, so I would not feel a single ounce of pity when the execution finally came. I turned away from the table and walked out of the private dining alcove. My sensible heels clicked softly against the hardwood floors of the upscale restaurant. I walked past the busy hostess stand, past the crowded valet station, and out into the warm southern night. Friday at 5 in the afternoon. He had given me a strict deadline to surrender. I smiled as I unlocked my unassuming gray sedan. The leather steering wheel felt cool against my palms. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a brief glimpse of my own calm expression. I took a very slow, steady breath. He thought he was putting me on a countdown. He had no idea he was actually scheduling his own professional funeral. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I had 3 days left to finish auditing the offshore accounts and transfer the final leveraged properties into my holding company. I shifted the car into gear, pulling out onto Peachtree Street. The mediation dinner had served its exact purpose. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that neither my husband nor his golden sister deserved a single drop of mercy. The drive back to Buckhead took exactly 22 minutes. I pulled my unassuming gray sedan into the cavernous 3-car garage parking next to the empty space where Andre usually kept his matte black Range Rover. He was likely still at the restaurant with Chloe, celebrating his perceived victory and planning exactly how he would spend the weekend moving his new billionaire heiress into my home. The house was completely dark when I stepped inside. The silence was absolute. I did not turn on the main lights. I walked through the shadows of the grand foyer, my heels making soft, rhythmic thuds against the imported hardwood. I bypassed the luxurious living spaces I had meticulously designed and went straight to the only room in the house that truly belonged to me. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my home office and stepped inside. To the rest of the world, this room was just a quiet space where a boring accountant balanced modest spreadsheets. I walked over to the standard mahogany desk and reached underneath my fingers, finding the hidden biometric scanner mounted out of sight. I pressed my thumb against the glass panel. A soft chime echoed in the dark room, and the false back wall of the bookshelf slid open smoothly on silent tracks. I stepped into my actual workspace. It was a climate-controlled server room and command center that rivaled the trading floors of Wall Street. 6 ultra-high-definition curved monitors spanned the length of a custom steel desk. A dedicated liquid-cooled processing tower hummed with quiet, massive power. This was where JV Holdings truly existed. This was where I moved capital across continents, where I acquired commercial debt, and where I had secretly built the safety net that kept my ungrateful husband from plummeting into financial ruin. I sat down in the ergonomic mesh chair and cracked my knuckles. I woke the system and the 6 screens flared to life, bathing the dark room in a sharp blue light. I had 3 days until Andre's Friday deadline. I needed to finish reviewing the financing structures and preparing enforcement actions against his highly leveraged commercial properties. But as I opened the master ledgers for his real estate development firm, something entirely different caught my eye. It was a tiny anomaly, a slight misclassification in the quarterly operational expenses. To a standard auditor, it would look like a simple rounding error or a misfiled vendor invoice. But I was not a standard auditor. I was an apex predator in a digital jungle, and I had just spotted a drop of blood on the leaves. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the cascading rows of financial data. I pulled up the accounts payable ledger for his largest current project, a luxury high-rise condominium complex in Midtown. The project had been hemorrhaging cash for 6 months, which Andre blamed on supply chain issues and rising material costs. I had personally authorized a $4 million bailout through JV Holdings just to keep the construction moving. I isolated a series of recurring payments made to a third-party vendor listed as CLC Logistics. The invoices claimed they were for specialized architectural consulting and imported building materials. I ran a cross-reference on the vendor identification number. I pulled the public state registry filings and cross-referenced the vendor information against the transaction records already available through JV Holdings' proprietary software. The registered agent for CLC Logistics was a registered shell corporation located in Delaware, but the initial registration fee had been paid using a personal credit card. I pulled the transaction receipt. The card belonged to Chloe. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Andre was not just a terrible businessman who made bad investments. He was an active criminal. He was embezzling money from his own development firm. He and his golden stepsister were creating fraudulent invoices, siphoning capital away from the construction projects and funneling it directly into Chloe's shell company. I opened another window and began aggressively tracing every single payment made to CLC Logistics over the past 3 years. The numbers scrolled across my screens in an endless waterfall of betrayal. $30,000 here, $50,000 there. A massive wire transfer of $200,000 hidden deep within a quarterly tax write-off. They had stolen millions. They thought they were stealing from a faceless conglomerate of wealthy angel investors. They thought they had outsmarted a room full of old money billionaires. They had absolutely no idea they were stealing directly from my personal bank accounts. I thought about Chloe sitting at the restaurant less than an hour ago, sipping vintage champagne and mocking my boring clothes. I thought about her bragging that she was going to turn my side of the master closet into a massive shoe gallery. Now I knew exactly how she afforded her lavish lifestyle, her designer handbags, and her constant luxury vacations. She was living on my dime, stealing it right out from under me with the enthusiastic help of my husband. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the quiet clicking filling the room like a drumbeat. I was no longer just preparing a divorce settlement. I was preparing a financial execution. I initiated a deep dive tracking, where the embezzled funds went after they hit the Delaware Shell Corporation. The money did not stay domestic. Andre was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew that sudden massive influxes of cash into his personal accounts would trigger an Internal Revenue Service audit. I followed the digital paper trail, watching the money bounce through a series of complex international wire transfers. It moved from Delaware to a dummy corporation in Cyprus, then splintered into dozens of microtransactions routed through the British Virgin Islands. It was a sophisticated money laundering technique designed to exhaust and confuse any standard forensic accountant. But they were not dealing with a standard accountant. They were dealing with the woman who wrote the exact software algorithms used by federal investigators to catch corporate fraud. By just past 2 in the morning, I had finished tracing the transaction chain through the records available to me. The money had reconverged. It was sitting in 3 heavily guarded offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I pulled up the account balances. Over $8 million in stolen liquid cash sat waiting in the dark. I stared at the staggering figure, and suddenly another piece of the conversation at the restaurant made perfect sense. Andre had bragged about entering a new stratosphere of wealth. At the time, I had assumed it was just another expression of his inflated ego. But now the financial trail suggested he was preparing for a much larger alliance. Andre was not just leaving me for a younger, wealthier woman. He was planning to use the $8 million he stole from me to buy his way into her elite family. He was going to use my money to fund his shiny new life and secure his place among the Atlanta elite. A cold, predatory smile spread slowly across my face. I reached for my coffee mug, taking a slow sip of the cold liquid. I did not touch the offshore accounts directly. That distinction mattered. The money might have originated from capital supplied by JV Holdings, but once Andre and Chloe routed it through shell entities and offshore accounts, I could not simply reach across international banking systems and take it back because I believed it belonged to me. I needed to use the contractual rights already built into the financing structure. I pulled up the original investment agreements and located the fraud and asset diversion provisions I had drafted years earlier. Any deliberate diversion of JV Holdings capital into undisclosed related party accounts triggered an immediate suspension of funding, a contractual asset recall, and emergency enforcement rights against the collateral pledged to secure the investment. I prepared a formal fraud package containing the CLC logistics invoices, the routing history, the offshore account identifiers, and the supporting corporate records. I transmitted the package through counsel to the financial institutions responsible for the relevant transactions and issued notice that JV Holdings was invoking its contractual remedies. The offshore money itself would remain untouched until the banks and investigators determined what could legally be frozen, recovered, or returned. But Andre's access to fresh capital was over immediately. I suspended every discretionary credit facility controlled by JV Holdings. I terminated the revolving advances that had quietly funded Vanguard's payroll and construction overruns. I issued formal notices of default across the agreements Andre had violated. On my screens, nothing exploded and no mysterious progress bar raced toward zero. The effect was far more dangerous because it was completely legitimate. The pipelines keeping Andre alive simply stopped. From that point forward, the offshore institutions and investigators controlled what happened to those accounts. My job was finished. I had identified the diversion preserved, the evidence invoked my contractual rights, and cut off every legitimate source of fresh capital Andre still depended on. I leaned back in my mesh chair, the blue light of the monitors casting long shadows against the walls of the hidden server room. I had successfully stopped Andre from accessing another dollar of my capital and had set the recovery process in motion. But leaving them broke was simply not enough. I needed to ensure that when Andre finally fell, he would take his golden sister and his entire arrogant reputation down with him. I minimized the banking windows and pulled up the property deeds for his remaining real estate developments, ready to completely sever the last remaining threads of his fraudulent empire. The financial rug had been pulled completely out from under them. They were in a state of absolute free fall. They just had not hit the ground yet. I reached for my phone as it buzzed loudly on the desk. An email notification popped up on the screen. It was an automated VIP invitation forwarded from Andre's primary assistant. It was a formal digital request requesting my mandatory attendance at the massive Vanguard real estate merger gala scheduled for Friday evening. The invitation was dripping with corporate arrogance. This was the exact event where Andre planned to publicly announce his divorce, his new business merger, and his new high society engagement. He wanted me there, so I could watch him ascend to his imaginary throne. I locked my phone and set it back on the desk. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire city. I cracked my neck, feeling the tension release from my shoulders. I was going to give him the greatest show Atlanta had ever seen. I turned back to my monitors and began organizing the final enforcement packages that would place Andre's most valuable developments under formal financial pressure. Cutting off Andre's access to fresh capital was just the opening maneuver. Liquid cash was the lifeblood of Andre's daily operations, but his ego was entirely tied to the physical skyline of Atlanta. He loved pointing to towering cranes and glass facades, proudly telling anyone who would listen that he was reshaping the city. He truly believed he was a visionary real estate mogul. He forgot that a building only belongs to the person who holds the paper. I turned my attention to the second monitor on my massive display array, pulling up the master property deeds for his entire commercial portfolio. Andre currently held 7 major commercial properties under his primary development group. 5 of them were heavily leveraged, meaning they were financed through massive loans that required strict monthly capital injections to keep the banks from calling the debt. I had structured those loans myself. I had also structured the primary holding company that held the ultimate collateral rights. That holding company was JV Holdings. I initiated the first phase of enforcement. The mezzanine financing agreements gave JV Holdings powerful remedies if Vanguard committed fraud, diverted collateral, or materially misrepresented its financial condition. Andre had managed to trigger nearly every one of them. I started with the Midtown development. Rather than pretending I could transfer a multi-million-dollar deed with a keyboard shortcut, I issued formal default notices through the entities holding Vanguard's secured debt and pledged ownership interests. I instructed counsel to begin enforcement against the equity Andre had pledged as collateral and to seek appointment of a receiver where necessary to prevent further dissipation of assets. The process would require filings, notices, and documentation, but the economic result was already becoming unavoidable. Andre could no longer sell, refinance, or secretly encumber the Midtown project without confronting the lender that actually controlled his financing. Next came the commercial plaza in the northern suburbs, where Chloe planned to open her new flagship boutique. That project was governed by the same financing structure. I triggered the corresponding default provisions and froze any further JV Holdings capital from flowing into the development. Chloe still thought she was about to receive a luxury retail empire. In reality, the project was now entering enforcement because she and Andre had diverted the very capital keeping it alive. One by one, I placed the major developments into formal enforcement review. The downtown office complex, the warehouse district project, and the boutique hotel development were each tied to financing structures Andre had violated. Council began preparing the corresponding notices, filings, and collateral enforcement actions, while I suspended every additional dollar of discretionary JV Holdings funding. I worked with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon excising a malignant tumor. I left him with a development firm whose major assets were now tied up in default proceedings and whose future financing had effectively disappeared. But stripping him of the assets was only half the execution. The true punishment lay in the debt. When Andre originally signed the financing agreements for several of these projects, he insisted on personally guaranteeing portions of the debt. At the time, he called it proof that he believed in himself. I had warned him that personal guarantees were not trophies. They were promises that survived when the business failed. Now those guarantees mattered. If enforcement ultimately resulted in the collateral being sold or transferred, the value recovered from those properties would be credited against the secured debt. Andre would not somehow lose $40 million worth of real estate and still owe the exact same $40 million as if the collateral had never existed. But if the projects were worth less than the outstanding obligations, after costs, senior liens, and enforcement expenses, the remaining deficiency could still follow him personally under the guarantees he had signed. That was the part Andre had never bothered to understand. The buildings might eventually satisfy a large portion of the debt. They might even satisfy most of it. But his fraud had destroyed the financing relationships, the future revenue streams, and the equity he believed made him wealthy. And if a deficiency remained, he would have to answer for that too. He was not suddenly $40 million in debt because I pressed a button. He was financially exposed because years earlier he had signed contracts he never imagined anyone would actually enforce. I turned my attention to the operational accounts. Identifying the stolen $8 million in the Cayman Islands had given investigators a clear recovery target, but I still needed to ensure Andre and Chloe could not siphon another dime through the accounts and credit facilities my companies legally controlled. I turned next to the operational accounts and credit facilities that were legally controlled by JV Holdings. I instructed the authorized administrators to revoke Andre and Chloe's discretionary access wherever the governing agreements gave my companies that authority. Chloe was still an authorized user on an unlimited corporate black card, and Andre continued using secondary expense privileges tied to capital my companies provided. I canceled Chloe's authorized user card and terminated Andre's secondary expense privileges. The next time they tried to charge another luxury purchase to accounts funded through my companies, the transactions would be declined. The next time they tried to purchase a celebratory dinner or book a luxury flight, their cards would violently decline. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms over my head. The digital clock on my primary monitor read 6:30 in the morning. I had been working through the night, operating on pure adrenaline and cold, absolute focus. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light through the narrow high windows of my hidden server room. I had successfully executed the most comprehensive silent financial assassination in the history of Atlanta real estate. I locked the terminal, securing the network behind 5 layers of military-grade encryption. I triggered the hidden latch, and the heavy false back wall of the bookshelf slid shut behind me, hiding the command center from view. I walked out of the home office and into the quiet hallway. The Buckhead mansion was completely silent. I walked into the custom kitchen feeling a strange sense of total serenity. I turned on the espresso machine and watched the dark liquid pour into my mug. Just as I took my first sip, a sharp knock echoed from the front of the house. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the kitchen wall. A young man wearing a crisp uniform stood on the front porch, holding a thick rectangular envelope. A private courier service. I walked to the front door and pulled it open. The morning air was cool and fragrant. The courier offered a polite professional smile, handing me an electronic clipboard to sign. I scribbled my initials and took the heavy envelope. It was made of thick, textured black cardstock, sealed with a silver wax stamp. I walked back into the kitchen, sliding my finger under the flap to break the seal. Inside was a massive, glossy invitation. The silver foil lettering caught the light. It was an arrogant, ostentatious VIP invitation to the Vanguard Real Estate Merger Gala, scheduled for tomorrow evening at the city's most exclusive art museum. I ran my fingers over the raised silver lettering of the invitation. It invited the recipient to celebrate the monumental expansion of Vanguard Real Estate and the exclusive unveiling of the Midtown Tower project. Below the corporate announcement was a secondary, deeply personal note printed in elegant cursive font. It formally announced the upcoming union of Andre Vaughn to Miss Victoria Kensington, the daughter of Atlanta's most notorious billionaire property developer. The sheer audacity of the document was breathtaking. Andre was not just throwing a party to celebrate a business merger. He was throwing a massive grand coronation to cement his legacy. He planned to stand proudly on a magnificent stage in front of the wealthiest investors, politicians, and socialites in the entire state of Georgia to announce his newly acquired empire and his brand new high society engagement. He had sent this VIP invitation directly to our home via private courier to ensure I received it. It was a deliberate, calculated slap in the face. He wanted me to attend the gala. He wanted me to stand in the very back of the incredibly crowded room, wearing one of my boring practical dresses, and watch him ascend to his imaginary throne. He wanted his golden stepsister Chloe to smirk at me from the exclusive VIP section while she sipped expensive champagne paid for by the very company she was actively embezzling from. They wanted me to witness my own replacement. They wanted me to feel utterly powerless, insignificant, and entirely replaced by a woman who represented the elite status they so desperately craved. The entire invitation was designed to break my spirit and reinforce his absolute superiority. I placed the heavy black invitation onto the pristine marble surface of the kitchen island. I picked up my coffee mug, taking another slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast tasted incredibly sweet. Andre wanted a massive public spectacle. He wanted to completely humiliate me in front of the entire city to prove that he had completely outgrown the small-time accountant who used to balance his books. I was eagerly expecting a weeping, defeated ex-wife to show up and quietly accept her public humiliation. He was expecting a helpless, broken victim. I smiled, staring down at the silver wax seal resting on the polished stone counter. I was going to give him the greatest, truly unforgettable show this city had ever witnessed in its entire corporate history. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat typical of late spring in Georgia. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, taking a final, meticulous inventory of my armor. For 12 long years, I had dressed to blend perfectly into the background. I had deliberately chosen sensible business suits and muted beige colors to ensure I never overshadowed my husband. I was the supportive background character in his grand production. Tonight, however, that role was permanently retired. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown that I had kept hidden at a private tailor in Midtown. It had no visible designer logos and no flashy sequins. It was the absolute epitome of stealth wealth. The rich fabric moved like water, and the tailoring was flawless, hugging my frame perfectly. My natural hair was styled in an elegant, sophisticated updo that commanded immediate respect. I clasped a vintage diamond tennis bracelet around my right wrist, a piece I had acquired at a private auction in London 3 years ago and never dared to wear in front of Andre. I slipped my phone into a structured black leather clutch. I was completely ready. The drive to the High Museum of Art was surprisingly peaceful. I navigated my unassuming gray sedan through the congested streets of downtown Atlanta, feeling absolutely no anxiety or fear. The museum had been completely transformed for the Vanguard Real Estate Merger Gala. Massive white spotlights swept across the modern architecture of the building, piercing the dark night sky. A plush red carpet led up the sweeping front steps, flanked by heavy velvet ropes and aggressive private security personnel. I pulled my car up to the valet stand. The young valet hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly expecting a fleet of imported sports cars or luxury limousines. I handed him the keys with a polite, warm smile and walked past the flashing cameras of local society photographers. They ignored me entirely, waiting for the real celebrities and billionaires of the evening to arrive. That suited me perfectly. I wanted to slip inside unnoticed. I stepped through the towering glass doors and into the soaring atrium. The space was packed with the most influential power brokers in the state of Georgia. Politicians, banking executives, and real estate tycoons mingled under the brilliant lighting, holding crystal champagne flutes. A professional string quartet played a modern symphony in the corner, filling the vast room with beautiful music. Waiters circulated with silver trays, offering beluga caviar and delicate truffle appetizers. An enormous ice sculpture depicting the Vanguard Real Estate logo dominated the center of the buffet. I overheard two junior executives praising Andre's brilliant market strategies, completely unaware that his strategies consisted of funneling money into offshore accounts and lying to his contractors. The sheer opulence of the event was staggering, and it made me smile internally. Every single floral arrangement, every imported delicacy, and every hour of the venue rental had been paid for using corporate credit accounts I had systematically frozen just 24 hours ago. They were currently partying on a tab that would violently bounce the moment the vendors attempted to process the final holds. I walked slowly down the curved ramp toward the main exhibition hall. The tension in my chest was completely gone, replaced by a hyper-focused calm. I was a ghost walking through a corporate graveyard of my own making. I spotted Andre's extended family almost immediately. His mother and two older aunts were holding court near a towering modern art sculpture. For years I had cooked their massive Thanksgiving dinners, hosted their lavish birthday parties, and quietly paid off their staggering credit card debts when Andre begged me to hide the expenses from his business partners. His mother caught my eye across the crowded room. Her welcoming smile instantly dropped, transforming into a tight, resentful sneer. She leaned over and whispered something behind her hand to her sister. In perfect choreographed unison, the three women turned their backs to me. It was a deliberate, cruel shunning designed to put me in my place. I felt a few other guests notice the hostile interaction. The whispers began to ripple through the affluent crowd near me. Look at her showing up here. How embarrassing. Does she not have any pride left? I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely serene. I allowed them to believe their petty social exclusion was genuinely wounding me. I walked to a nearby bar, requested a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime, and took a quiet position near a marble pillar in the very back corner of the room. A sudden dramatic hush fell over the massive atrium as the string quartet shifted into a triumphant swelling piece of music. All eyes turned toward the grand sweeping staircase at the center of the hall. Andre appeared at the top of the stairs looking like a conquering emperor returning from a victorious battle. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket, his smile impossibly wide and arrogant. Clinging tightly to his left arm was Victoria Kensington. She was a decade younger than me, draped in an ostentatious silver gown, covered in heavy sparkling crystals. She looked exactly like the spoiled billionaire heiress she was. The crowd erupted into polite but incredibly enthusiastic applause. Andre waved magnanimously, soaking in the absolute adoration of his peers. He was parading his new wealthy prize in front of the city, cementing his status as Atlanta's newest heavyweight developer. Standing near the bottom of the staircase was Victoria's father, the notorious billionaire property developer. He clapped Andre on the shoulder, looking incredibly proud to welcome this rising star into his elite family. They had likely spent the entire afternoon reviewing fraudulent merger documents and celebrating a partnership built entirely on stolen capital. Andre genuinely believed he had won everything. He believed he had successfully discarded his boring accountant wife, upgraded his social standing, and secured his financial future through a massive corporate merger. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching him slowly descend the marble stairs. It was a fascinating psychological study to witness in real time. I was looking at a man who was entirely bankrupt, financially ruined, and facing imminent federal charges for corporate embezzlement. Yet he was smiling and waving like he owned the entire world. The absolute delusion of his reality was breathtaking. He reached the bottom of the stairs, and the wealthy crowd swallowed them up, eager to offer congratulations on the merger and the impending high society engagement. I remained in my quiet, shadowed corner, observing the flow of the room, letting them enjoy their final moments of blissful ignorance. That was when the dynamic of the room violently shifted. I saw a flash of bright crimson silk moving aggressively through the dense crowd. It was Chloe. Her dress trailed behind her, dragging across the polished floor as she marched. She had been holding court in the elevated VIP section reserved strictly for board members and major investors. She must have spotted me standing by the marble pillar from her high vantage point. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. She looked erratic, flush with the arrogance of her perceived new wealth, and clearly intoxicated by the vintage champagne. She pushed past a group of powerful banking executives, spilling half of her expensive drink onto the floor in the process. The crowd parted for her, avoiding the messy display of anger. She was not walking alone. She had flagged down a massive, imposing man wearing a dark tailored suit with a Vanguard security earpiece. It was the head of security for the entire museum event. Chloe marched directly toward my corner, pointing a manicured finger right at my chest. Her voice rose sharply above the polite, sophisticated chatter of the room, drawing the immediate attention of dozens of nearby guests. She was practically vibrating with unhinged rage that her discarded former sister-in-law had dared to contaminate her perfect evening of triumph. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted to assert her ultimate dominance and prove once and for all that I did not belong in their elite world. Enraged that I dared to show up, Chloe marched over with the head of security to have me publicly thrown out. Chloe closed the distance between us with the stomping, aggressive stride of a woman who fully believed her own fabricated mythology. Her bright crimson silk dress dragged across the polished marble floor of the museum atrium, and her eyes were entirely dilated with a mixture of vintage champagne and unhinged arrogance. She had flagged down a massive imposing man wearing a dark tailored suit and a discreet communication earpiece. I was clearly the director of private security for the museum event. I remained perfectly still, leaning slightly against the cold marble pillar in the shadowed corner of the grand hall. I did not adjust my posture. I did not put down my crystal glass. I watched her approach with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable chemical reaction. "What are you doing here?" Chloe demanded, her voice slicing through the sophisticated ambient chatter of the surrounding guests. She did not bother to keep her volume down. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta, to prove to her new billionaire friends that she belonged in their elite social circle, and I did not. I took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the rim of the glass. "I am attending a corporate gala." "Chloe," I replied, my voice dropping to a calm, quiet register that forced her to strain to hear me. "It is a lovely evening for a celebration." "You do not belong here," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "This is an exclusive VIP event for real investors and high net worth individuals. This is not a charity dinner for discarded wives who cannot take a hint. Andre is merging his company with the Kensington family tonight. He is marrying a woman who actually brings value to his life. You are nothing but a bitter broke ex-wife stalking him because you want a handout." The string quartet continued to play a lively symphony in the background, but the immediate vicinity had fallen completely silent. Wealthy socialites, banking executives, and local politicians paused their conversations, turning their heads to watch the drama unfold. They held their champagne flutes close to their chests, their eyes darting between my understated emerald gown and Chloe's aggressive crimson display. Andre was still standing near the bottom of the grand staircase, completely oblivious to the confrontation happening in the back of the room. He was too busy smiling for the photographers with Victoria to notice that his golden stepsister was currently initiating his absolute destruction. Chloe turned to the large security director standing beside her. "Remove her," she commanded, pointing at me again. "She snuck in here to cause a scene and extort money from my brother. She does not have the clearance to be in this building. Throw her out right now." The security director stepped forward. He was a professional, carrying himself with the rigid discipline of former law enforcement. He looked at me, taking in my completely unbothered expression and my calm demeanor. He could clearly see the contrast between Chloe's erratic, intoxicated hostility and my absolute stillness. But his job was to maintain order, and Chloe was loudly identifying herself as the sister of the guest of honor. The security director said, his voice a low rumble designed to de-escalate tension. "I am Director Reynolds. I oversee the private security detail for this facility. I am going to have to ask for your name and your invitation. If you are not on the approved guest list, I must ask you to head toward the front exit." I looked at Director Reynolds, maintaining respectful but unyielding eye contact. "My name is Jada Vaughn," I said clearly, so the surrounding guests could hear. "She is using my brother's last name," Chloe interrupted, her face flushing an angry shade of red. "They are getting a divorce. She is a fraud. She works as a boring little bookkeeper in a cubicle somewhere. She has absolutely zero capital to invest in Vanguard real estate. I want her physically removed before she embarrasses my family any further." I did not look at Chloe. I reached into my structured black leather clutch and pulled out the heavy black cardstock envelope. I extended my hand, offering the document to Director Reynolds. "This invitation was delivered directly to my home by private courier yesterday morning," I explained smoothly. "You will find that it is a formal VIP pass, bearing the official silver wax seal of Vanguard Real Estate. I was specifically requested to attend this merger announcement. I am not trespassing, Director Reynolds. I am exactly where I was invited to be." Director Reynolds took the heavy envelope and slid the invitation out. He inspected the silver foil lettering and the authentic wax seal. He frowned, looking down at his digital tablet to cross-reference the master guest list. "She probably stole it," Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. Or Andre sent it out of pity before he realized she would actually have the nerve to show up wearing a dress she probably rented. It does not matter what piece of paper she is holding. She is a disruption to a private corporate event, and the host family wants her gone. If you do not grab her by the arm and throw her out onto the street right now, I will make sure your security firm never gets another contract in this city again. Do you know who my new family is? It was a fascinating display of weaponized privilege. She was using her proximity to the Kensington billionaire family to threaten a working man simply to satisfy her own petty cruelty. She was projecting her own massive financial insecurities entirely onto me. She desperately needed me to be poor and humiliated so she could feel wealthy and powerful. Director Reynolds looked up from his digital tablet. His brow was furrowed in confusion. "Ma'am," he said, speaking to me. "Your name is on the guest list, but it is flagged with a secondary security protocol. I need to verify your credentials with the event management team." I gave him a warm, polite smile. "Of course, Director Reynolds. You are simply doing your job. But before you call the event management team, I suggest you contact your Central Dispatch Command." Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Central Dispatch? Who do you think you are talking to? You cannot intimidate us with your fake corporate jargon, Jada. You are a nobody." I ignored her entirely, keeping my focus locked directly on the security director. "Director Reynolds," I said, my tone shifting into the sharp, commanding cadence of a chief executive officer. "You are the head of security for this specific museum facility. Your security firm is contracted directly through the museum board of directors to protect this property. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied cautiously, his defensive posture shifting slightly as he recognized the sudden authority in my voice. "And this museum facility sits on 3 acres of prime downtown real estate." I continued, stepping half an inch forward. "The land and the physical building structure are owned through a JV Holdings property subsidiary. The museum operates under a long-term lease, and its major property management and security contracts run through that ownership structure. A trust that dictates the operational budget, the vendor contracts, and the ultimate security protocols for every single event held on these premises." "Do you know the name of the corporate trust that owns the very floor you are standing on, Director Reynolds?" He stared at me, the color slowly beginning to drain from his face as a terrifying realization began to form in his mind. He reached up with a trembling hand and pressed 2 fingers against his communication earpiece. "Call your command center," I instructed softly but firmly. "Tell them JV Holdings is standing in the atrium. Tell them to verify the ultimate beneficiary of the commercial property trust that signs their paychecks." Chloe threw her hands up in the air, turning to the wealthy crowd of onlookers who had formed a tight circle around us. "This is insane," she declared dramatically. "She is completely delusional. She is making up fake companies to sound important. I am not listening to this garbage for another second. Grab her and drag her outside before I call the actual police to have her arrested for trespassing." Director Reynolds did not move to grab me. He stood perfectly rigid, pressing his earpiece deeper into his ear to hear the panicked voice of his central dispatcher on the other end of the secure radio channel. The affluent guests surrounding us watched in absolute silence, captivated by the shifting power dynamic. They could see the profound physical change coming over the massive security director. He was no longer looking at me as a potential threat or an unwanted guest. He was looking at me with the absolute terrified deference of a man staring directly at his ultimate employer. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, enjoying the cool, refreshing taste of the lime. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to build until it was practically suffocating. I watched the arrogant smirk on Chloe's face slowly begin to falter as she realized the security director was not moving to follow her aggressive commands. "Well," Chloe demanded, tapping her designer high heel impatiently against the marble floor. "What are you waiting for? Throw this bitter broke ex-wife out of my party." Director Reynolds slowly lowered his hand from his earpiece. His face was entirely devoid of color, rendering him a pale ashen gray. He took a very deliberate step back, creating a wide, respectful distance between himself and my emerald green gown. He turned his head slowly and looked directly into Chloe's angry, entitled eyes. He stood at his full height, squaring his broad shoulders before delivering the final, devastating blow to her fabricated reality. Ma'am, he stated, his voice booming loudly enough to echo across the silent, crowded hall. I cannot remove the owner of the building. The declaration hung in the air, suspended in the heavy silence of the grand atrium. Director Reynolds stood perfectly still, his posture radiating absolute professional discipline. He did not blink. He did not shift his gaze. He simply stared down at Chloe, watching her entire fabricated reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. Chloe's jaw actually dropped. The deep crimson flush of anger that had consumed her face completely drained away, leaving her looking hollow and pale. She stared at the massive security director, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate confusion. She looked around at the circle of wealthy onlookers, expecting someone to step forward and tell her this was just an elaborate practical joke. She expected someone from her newly acquired high society circle to validate her power. No one moved. The elite banking executives and socialites simply stared back at her, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to thinly veiled disgust. They were apex predators in the corporate world, and they could smell blood in the water. They instantly recognized that Chloe had just humiliated herself by attempting to bully the most powerful person in the building. Are you insane? Chloe finally stammered, her voice trembling as she pointed a shaking finger at me. She is a bookkeeper. She works in a cubicle. She drives a gray sedan. She does not own a museum. Director Reynolds did not engage with her frantic denial. He kept his hands clasped neatly behind his back. Ma and I have verified the credentials through Central Command. Mrs. Jada Vaughn is the sole beneficial owner of the JV holding structure that owns this property. She is my employer. I will not ask her to leave. However, if you continue to create a disturbance, I will have to ask you to vacate the premises. The sheer humiliation was absolute. Chloe took a stumbling step backward, her designer high heel catching slightly on the hem of her crimson silk dress. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with hot, angry tears of total defeat. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment she deserved. I gave Director Reynolds a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging his professionalism. I turned away from the trembling golden child, leaving her to suffocate in the agonizing silence of the crowd. I walked smoothly away from the marble pillar, blending back into the flow of the gala. The atmosphere in the massive hall was beginning to shift. The ambient lighting slowly dimmed, casting deep dramatic shadows across the modern art installations. The professional string quartet played a final sweeping chord before laying their instruments to rest. A crisp, commanding voice echoed over the state-of-the-art public address system, asking all guests to direct their attention to the center of the atrium. It was time for the main event. I found a quiet vantage point near the center aisle, perfectly positioned in the shadows. A brilliant white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the grand sweeping staircase. The crowd gathered around the base of the stairs, holding their crystal champagne flutes, murmuring with eager anticipation. Andre stepped into the harsh glare of the spotlight. He looked completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. He wore his midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had conquered the world. He gripped Victoria Kensington's hand tightly, pulling her into the light beside him. She smiled radiantly, her heavy silver gown sparkling under the intense illumination. They looked like the perfect billionaire power couple ready to rule the Atlanta real estate market. Andre guided Victoria down the final few steps and walked directly toward the custom acrylic podium positioned at the front of the grand stage. The massive digital screens behind the podium displayed the sleek silver logo of Vanguard Real Estate alongside the Kensington family crest. It was a visual representation of the fraudulent merger he was about to announce. He stepped up to the microphone, tapping it lightly. A sharp feedback whine briefly pierced the hall before settling into a smooth, resonant echo. "Good evening, everyone," Andre said, his deep, charismatic voice filling the massive room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate a monumental milestone." Looking out at this crowd, I see the absolute best and brightest minds in Georgia. I see visionaries. I see leaders. But most importantly, I see the future of this great city. The crowd offered a polite, warm round of applause. Andre paused, soaking in the validation like a man dying of thirst. He leaned closer to the microphone, resting his hands confidently on the edges of the acrylic podium. 10 years ago, I started Vanguard Real Estate with nothing but a vision and an unrelenting drive to succeed. Andre continued, feeding the audience his completely fabricated mythology. People told me the market was too saturated. They told me I lacked the pedigree to sit at the big tables. But I have never been someone who takes no for an answer. I put in the sweat equity. I took the massive financial risks that others were too terrified to take. I built this empire from the dirt up with my own 2 hands. I stood in the shadows, listening to the sheer volume of his delusion. He was standing on a stage paid for by my frozen credit accounts, bragging about an empire I had secretly financed while preparing to merge assets that were already tied up in active default and enforcement proceedings. His narcissism was practically radiating off him in waves. Tonight, we are not just celebrating the success of Vanguard Real Estate, Andre proclaimed, his voice rising with theatrical passion. We are celebrating a historic union, a merging of 2 great families and 2 massive portfolios. I want to personally thank my new partner and future father-in-law for trusting me with his incredible legacy. Together, the Vanguard and Kensington merger will dominate the commercial skyline for generations to come. The audience erupted into enthusiastic applause. Victoria beamed beside him, looking up at Andre with absolute adoration. She genuinely believed she was marrying a self-made titan of industry. And to cement this historic partnership, Andre said, turning slightly to look at Victoria, his hand reaching into the inner pocket of his velvet tuxedo jacket. I want to make another very special announcement tonight. Because a king cannot build an empire without a queen who truly understands his vision. It was time. I stepped out from the shadows of the center aisle. The brilliant white ambient light caught the rich fabric of my emerald green silk gown. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, predatory cadence of a woman who held the executioner's axe. The guests standing near the back of the aisle noticed me first. The wealthy socialites and banking executives who had just witnessed the complete destruction of Chloe at the back of the hall recognized me instantly. They saw the cold, absolute determination in my eyes, and they instinctively stepped back. The crowd began to part for me, splitting down the middle like a zipper opening. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. The whispers spread rapidly, moving from the back of the hall toward the front row. Heads turned, glasses were lowered. The collective attention of the room shifted entirely away from the man speaking at the podium and locked directly onto me. Andre was completely oblivious to the shifting dynamic. He was too focused on pulling a small velvet jewelry box from his pocket and preparing his grand romantic gesture. He was staring deeply into Victoria's eyes, utterly blind to the reality marching straight down the center aisle. I reached the base of the stage. The front row of investors, including Victoria's billionaire father, stared at me in profound confusion. I did not acknowledge them. I placed my sensible heel onto the first wooden step. The sharp, confident click of my shoes against the hard wood cut through the brief, dramatic pause in Andre's speech. I was just opening his mouth to speak the words that would officially announce his fraudulent engagement. He raised the microphone toward his lips, his charismatic smile firmly in place. I walked up the final step and stepped directly into the blinding glare of the white spotlight. Andre froze. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he finally registered my presence. The charismatic smile instantly collapsed. The velvet jewelry box slipped slightly in his grip. Victoria gasped, taking a startled step backward, her heavy silver gown rustling loudly against the stage floor. She looked at me, then looked at Andre, completely bewildered by the sudden intrusion. Before Andre could formulate a single word, before he could even process the fact that his discarded wife was standing on his stage wearing an expensive gown, I moved. I stepped smoothly into his personal space, closing the physical distance between us. I reached out with a steady, unwavering hand and intercepted the microphone, pulling it directly out of his weakened grip. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Hundreds of the most powerful people in Atlanta stared up at the stage, holding their breath. I did not look at Andre. I did not look at Victoria. I held the microphone confidently in my right hand and turned my gaze out over the vast sea of faces. I looked toward the very back of the grand hall, locking eyes with the technical director sitting inside the elevated audio-visual booth. I raised my left hand high into the spotlight. I snapped my fingers. A sharp, echoing crack rang through the silent microphone. Instantly, the massive digital screens towering behind the podium flickered. The sleek silver logo of Vanguard Real Estate vanished. The majestic Kensington family crest was wiped completely off the display. The screens flared bright white before resolving into a series of massive, highly detailed spreadsheets. The displays were instantly flooded with heavily audited financial ledgers, banking routing numbers, offshore account balances, and highlighted records of corporate embezzlement. I stood in the center of the stage, fully prepared to burn his false empire to the ground. The massive digital screens cast a harsh blue glow across the faces of the stunned audience. Row after row of undeniable financial data loomed over us. I had instructed the technical director to highlight the most devastating transactions in bright crimson. The crowd of elite banking executives and investors recognized exactly what they were looking at. They did not need a translator to understand the universal language of corporate fraud. They saw the shell corporations, the fake vendor invoices, and the massive bleeding of capital. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Andre stood frozen beside me. He turned his head slowly, looking up at the towering screens. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His confident posture crumbled. He reached out with a trembling hand as if he could physically wipe the numbers off the digital display. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely audible without the microphone. Turn it off right now." I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the grand atrium, smooth and completely unyielding. "Good evening, everyone," I said, addressing the massive crowd. "My name is Jada Vaughn. I am the woman Andre just referred to as the small-time accountant holding him back. But looking at these screens, I think you will find my accounting skills are actually quite exceptional." "Turn the screens off!" Andre shouted, waving his arms frantically at the audio-visual booth. He lunged toward me, trying to snatch the microphone back. I simply took a calculated step out of his reach. The front row of security guards moved forward, but stopped dead when they recognized me as the ultimate owner of the building. They formed a physical barrier at the base of the stairs, ensuring no one interrupted my presentation. I directed my attention to the billionaire property developer standing in the front row. Victoria's father was staring at the screens with the furious, focused intensity of a man who realized he had almost been conned. "Mr. Kensington," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "You are a smart man. You built your legacy on thorough due diligence. I strongly suggest you look at the columns highlighted in crimson. Your future son-in-law did not build Vanguard Real Estate from the dirt up. He built it using $4 million of emergency bailout funds that I personally injected into his failing projects through a private investment trust." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Victoria stood frozen on the stage, her hands covering her mouth in absolute horror. "That is a lie!" Andre screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "She is a bitter, jealous ex-wife. She hacked into my presentation. She fabricated all of this data to ruin my merger. I am a self-made man." "You are a thief, Andre," I corrected sharply, my voice slicing through his frantic denial. I pressed a button on the small remote I held in my left hand. The screens behind us shifted, pulling up the exact routing numbers for CLC Logistics. "And you are not even a particularly smart thief. You and your sister Chloe created fraudulent vendor invoices. You funneled over $8 million of operational capital out of your construction budgets and washed it through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." I heard a loud crash from the back of the room. Chloe had dropped her second glass of vintage champagne. The crystal shattered against the marble floor. I clicked the remote again. The screens shifted to show the traced offshore transfer paths alongside the notices, confirming that the suspicious accounts had been referred to the relevant financial institutions and investigators for restriction and review. "You plan to use that stolen money to fund your new elite lifestyle." I continued, looking directly at Victoria, who was now physically backing away from Andre. "You thought you were stealing from a faceless group of angel investors. You had no idea that JV Holdings, the corporate entity bankrolling your entire existence, was solely owned and operated by me. I am the bank, Andre. And as of 5 o'clock yesterday morning, I executed a total asset recall." I froze every discretionary line of capital controlled by JV Holdings. I invoked the fraud and default provisions in your financing agreements. Your offshore transfers have been referred for investigation, and your major developments are now subject to enforcement actions based on the collateral you pledged. The empire you are standing here bragging about is no longer under your unrestricted control. Andre looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his velvet tuxedo jacket. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a lifeline. His eyes locked onto the VIP section. "Victor," he screamed, his voice echoing with desperate terror. "Victor, get down here right now. She is committing corporate espionage. She is violating my privacy. Do your job and shut this down. Threaten her with a lawsuit. Sue her for everything she has." The massive crowd parted once again. Victor Sterling, the most feared managing partner in Atlanta corporate law, slowly stepped out of the shadows. He walked down the center aisle with the measured heavy steps of a man walking to an execution. He did not look at Andre with the fierce protective loyalty of a hired attack dog. He looked at the floor, smoothing the front of his expensive charcoal suit. He reached the base of the stage, stopping right in front of the security perimeter. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the legendary lawyer to unleash his legal fury on the rogue wife. "Tell them it is a lie," Victor Andre demanded, gripping the edge of the clear acrylic podium. "Tell Mr. Kensington that my portfolio is solid. Tell them she is crazy." Victor slowly raised his head. He looked at Andre, and then he looked directly at me. He offered a small, respectful nod of absolute submission. He turned his attention to the crowd, clearing his throat. "My firm withdrew from representing Mr. Andre Vaughn earlier this week after identifying a material conflict." Victor stated, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet atrium. "I am not standing here tonight as his attorney. I can only confirm what the authenticated corporate records establish. Mrs. Jada Vaughn controls JV Holdings and the financing entities that have formally invoked contractual default and enforcement rights against Vanguard's pledged collateral." The absolute finality of Victor's statement landed like a bomb. The legendary lawyer had just publicly abandoned his client, confirming every single accusation of fraud. "No," Andre whispered, stumbling backward away from the podium. "No, that is impossible. Victor, you work for me. I pay your retainer." "You pay his retainer using my money," I clarified coldly. "And I cut off your credit yesterday. You cannot even afford to validate your parking ticket tonight, Andre." Down in the front row, the spell was finally broken. Mr. Kensington's face was purple with righteous fury. He was a man who did not tolerate embarrassment or financial liability. He marched up to the edge of the stage, pointing a thick, angry finger directly at Andre. "You arrogant, pathetic little con artist," Mr. Kensington roared. "You thought you could merge your fraudulent debt with my family's legacy. You thought you could use my daughter to bail out your sinking ship. The merger is dead. The engagement is over. If you ever contact my family again, I will personally see to it that you never work in this state again." He turned to Victoria, reaching out his hand. "Victoria, get down here right now. We are leaving." Victoria did not hesitate. She picked up the heavy skirt of her sparkling silver gown and practically ran down the stairs, tears of profound humiliation streaming down her face. She did not look back at Andre. She took her father's arm and they marched out of the grand hall, followed immediately by their entire entourage of wealthy relatives and investors. The mass exodus triggered a chain reaction. The elite banking executives who had been praising Andre just an hour ago turned their backs and began moving rapidly toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from the toxic fallout of federal fraud. Andre stood completely alone on the massive stage. His beautiful fabricated empire had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. His new fiancée was gone. His investors were fleeing. His lawyer had publicly abandoned him. The offshore money he had relied on was now tied up in an active financial investigation and completely beyond his easy reach. I walked over to him, my sensible heels clicking sharply against the floorboards of the stage. I reached into my structured black leather clutch and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I slapped it hard against the center of his chest, forcing him to reflexively grab it before it fell. "What is this?" he asked, his voice completely hollow and defeated. "That is a civil lawsuit for severe corporate fraud and gross embezzlement," I stated, my voice radiating pure authority. It is also your formal notice of termination. You are officially fired from Vanguard Real Estate. I am liquidating the operational shell tomorrow morning. I kept the liability clauses intact, though. You personally guaranteed portions of the commercial debt. Whatever value is recovered from the collateral will be credited against those obligations. But any remaining deficiency and every claim tied to your fraud will still follow you. You are financially ruined. I looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute devastation I had promised myself I would deliver. He was broken. I told you I was an apex predator, Andre. You just did not want to listen. I dropped the microphone onto the floor of the stage. It hit the wood with a loud, booming thud that echoed through the emptying museum. I turned my back on the man who had discarded me over a 30-second phone call. I walked gracefully down the stairs, my emerald silk gown trailing elegantly behind me, leaving him standing completely alone in the blinding spotlight staring at the paperwork that sealed his absolute destruction. 6 weeks is a surprisingly short amount of time to completely dismantle a human life, but when the foundation is built entirely on stolen money and a fragile ego, gravity works incredibly fast. The fallout from the Vanguard Real Estate merger gala was absolute and utterly merciless. The morning after my presentation on the museum stage, the federal authorities initiated a sweeping, highly coordinated investigation. By Monday afternoon, federal agents were carrying boxes of hard drives and financial ledgers out of Andre's corporate headquarters. The local news networks ran the story on an endless loop. The golden boy of Atlanta real estate was suddenly the face of the city's largest corporate embezzlement scandal. Chloe's descent into financial ruin was even swifter and decidedly more public. Without the constant illegal influx of stolen capital from my shadow accounts, her lavish lifestyle violently collapsed overnight. The bank immediately seized her luxury condo in the affluent northern suburbs. Her brand new imported sports car was repossessed directly from the parking lot of her favorite high-end salon while she was inside getting a blowout. The professional contractors she had hired to renovate her new flagship boutique completely abandoned the project the second her corporate credit cards aggressively declined. She frantically tried to reach out to her new elite social circle for a massive bailout. But the wealthy investors she had spent years aggressively courting treated her like a highly contagious disease. They blocked her phone number, ignored her desperate emails, and banned her from their exclusive country clubs. The family golden child was entirely bankrupt, socially exiled, and facing secondary conspiracy charges for her primary role in laundering the embezzled funds through her offshore shell corporation. I sat in my new penthouse office at JV Holdings, located right in the heart of the Atlanta financial district. I had chosen a space completely distinct from the toxic intimidation tactics Victor Sterling favored. My office was flooded with bright natural light featuring warm oak accents and lush green plants. It was a professional environment built on genuine stability and transparent, unyielding power. I wore a tailored ivory suit, my natural hair styled in thick, confident locks. I was reviewing the final liquidation reports for Vanguard Real Estate when my desk phone chimed with a soft, pleasant tone. My executive assistant, Marcus, a brilliant young man I had heavily recruited from a rival firm, spoke clearly through the intercom. Ms. Vaughn, I apologize for the sudden interruption, but there is a man in the main lobby demanding to see you right now. He does not have an appointment on the schedule. He says his name is Andre Vaughn. He is extremely agitated. Security is fully prepared to escort him off the premises if you prefer not to engage. I paused, my fingers hovering over the wireless keyboard. I smiled, looking out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline, realizing how perfectly the tables had turned. Send him in, Marcus, I instructed calmly. But please leave the heavy double doors wide open. 2 minutes later, Andre walked into my office. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant man who had stood on a museum stage in a midnight blue velvet tuxedo, looking like a conquering emperor, was completely gone. In his place was a hollow, frantic shell of a human being. He wore a wrinkled gray suit that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, surrounded by deep, dark circles of profound sleep deprivation. He looked like he had not eaten a solid meal in weeks. His hands were trembling slightly as he clutched a battered leather briefcase against his chest. He stepped onto the plush carpet of my corporate headquarters, looking around the massive, pristine space with a miserable mixture of absolute awe and sheer creeping terror. Jada, he rasped, his voice cracking as he stopped a few feet away from my enormous oak desk. He did not puff out his chest. He did not try to project his usual toxic dominance. He practically collapsed into one of the comfortable guest chairs, facing my workspace, burying his face in his hands. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, clasping my hands together, resting them gently on the polished oak surface. "Hello, Andre," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. "I must say I am surprised to see you here today. I naturally assumed you would be entirely occupied preparing for your upcoming federal indictment hearings." He flinched violently at the word federal, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He leaned forward, dropping his trembling hands, staring at me, with eyes swimming in desperate, panicked tears. "They are going to completely destroy me, Jada," he whispered, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. "The federal prosecutors are not offering a plea deal. They want to make a massive public example out of me. They are actively threatening 20 years in a federal penitentiary for the wire fraud and the corporate embezzlement. They seized my personal bank accounts yesterday. They froze my retirement funds. Kensington filed a massive civil suit against me for breach of contract and gross misrepresentation. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." I watched him crumble without feeling a single ounce of pity. For 12 years, I had exhausted my own spirit trying to protect this mediocre man from his own reckless incompetence. I had constantly shrunk my entire personality to ensure he felt powerful and respected. And now here he was, sitting in the very corporate office he used to heavily mock, begging the boring bookkeeper for ultimate salvation. That sounds like a severe sequence of legal consequences for a self-made man. I observed my voice slicing through his pathetic display of grief. "You told everyone you built your empire from the dirt up with your own two hands. You confidently told me you were entering a new elite stratosphere of wealth. Why are you sitting in my office complaining about your poor business choices?" He let out a ragged, desperate moan, gripping the edge of my desk. "Jada, please listen to me. I was stupid. I was arrogant and blind, and I made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I let my massive ego take complete control. I let Chloe get into my head with her delusions of grandeur. I know I treated you horribly, but we were legally married for 12 years. We built a life together. You cannot just sit there behind that desk and watch them send me to federal prison." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stared directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes, maintaining absolute, unyielding eye contact. "We did not build a life together, Andre." I corrected him sharply, my voice echoing in the large room. "I built a highly successful life, and you simply spent it. You took my absolute unwavering loyalty and you repaid it by trying to throw me out of my own home with a miserable $30,000 check. You attempted to hand my beautiful house to a woman who spent a decade mocking my African American heritage and belittling my career. You wanted to leave me entirely destitute while you partied with billionaires using my stolen money." I know, he pleaded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the desk harder. "I know I was a monster, but you have all the money, Jada. You hold all the commercial debt. You own everything in this city. You could easily make this go away. You could clear the commercial debt and give me a loan to hire a top-tier criminal defense team. Just a personal loan. I will sign whatever draconian contract you want. I will pay you back for the rest of my natural life. Just please do not let them put me in a cage." I was literally begging for his freedom. The man who had coldly discarded me over a 30-second phone call dictating that I could only speak to his vicious corporate lawyer was now groveling in my office, pleading for financial mercy. The irony was so incredibly potent it was almost intoxicating to witness. I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I let the absolute suffocating desperation hang heavily in the air between us. I slowly opened the top right drawer of my custom oak desk. I reached inside and retrieved a thin, simple manila folder. I placed it squarely on the desk, resting my hand flat on top of it. Andre watched my deliberate movements with wide, frantic eyes, hoping against hope that I was about to offer him a multi-million-dollar lifeline. "You know, Andre," I said softly, leaning forward to close the distance between us, "you once confidently told me that I needed to understand my position in this world. You told me to take what I was offered and walk away quietly before you changed your mind and left me with absolutely zero." You explicitly said it was the only sensible choice I had. I slid the manila folder precisely across the smooth mahogany wood. It stopped exactly halfway across the desk, resting right in front of his trembling hands. Andre stared down at the folder. His breathing hitched loudly in his chest. He slowly reached out with shaking fingers and flipped the cover open. Sitting inside the folder was the exact same insulting settlement offer he had instructed Victor Sterling to hand me 6 weeks ago. It was a standard cashier's check made out to Andre Vaughn in the amount of exactly $30,000. Attached to the check was a proposed marital settlement agreement, a strict non-disclosure agreement, and a permanent no-contact covenant. He looked from the pathetic $30,000 checkup to my face, his eyes widening with profound, devastating horror. He realized there was no salvation coming. "Take the $30,000, Andre," I commanded, my voice echoing with final absolute authority. "Use it to hire a bargain bin lawyer in a strip mall. Take the money, walk out of my building, and disappear completely. If you ever contact, threaten, or harass me again, I will document every incident and turn it over to the appropriate authorities." He stared at the paper, the reality of his total destruction finally settling deep into his bones. He had absolutely no leverage left to play. He slowly picked up the folder, his hands shaking violently, and stood up from the guest chair. He did not say another word. He turned around, his shoulders completely slumped, and walked out of my office, a ruined, defeated man, leaving me to rule the massive empire he could never truly claim. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Andre was gone. The silence that filled my penthouse office was not the suffocating tension I used to feel in our Buckhead home. It was the crisp, clean silence of absolute victory. I remained seated in my ergonomic chair, listening to the faint hum of the city traffic drifting up from the streets of Atlanta far below. For 12 years I had carried the exhausting weight of a mediocre man and his incredibly fragile ego. I had contorted my personality, bitten my tongue, and hidden my brilliance just to make sure he felt tall enough to stand in rooms he did not actually belong in. Now the weight was entirely lifted. My executive assistant, Marcus, walked into the office a few minutes later. He held a thick leather folio in his hands. He looked at the empty guest chair, and then at me, offering a small, respectful smile. He left the building without incident, Marcus reported, setting the folio gently on the edge of my desk. Security watched him walk out to the street. He did not even look back. And the courier from Victor Sterling's office just dropped this off. "They said it requires your immediate signature to finalize the dissolution." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, pulling the folio toward me. "You can take the rest of the afternoon off. The week has been exceptionally productive." Marcus thanked me and quietly exited the room, leaving me completely alone to finish the very last piece of business tying me to my past. I opened the leather folio. Inside rested the final, absolute divorce decree. It was a flawless legal document drafted entirely on my terms. There were no negotiations. There were no bitter mediations. Andre had surrendered every single marital asset, every claim to alimony, and every piece of property in exchange for the $30,000 he desperately needed for a criminal defense attorney. He had legally signed away his entire fabricated life to keep himself from drowning immediately. I opened the top drawer of my desk and reached inside. I bypassed the standard office pens and pulled out a heavy silver Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was the exact same luxury model Victor Sterling had dropped onto his hardwood floor in absolute terror the day I revealed my true identity. I had purchased one for myself the very next morning as a permanent physical reminder of the moment I stopped hiding in the shadows. I uncapped the pen. The silver metal felt perfectly balanced and cool against my skin. I turned to the final page of the heavy document. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single lingering ounce of grief or nostalgia. I pressed the IB to the thick paper and signed my name, Jada Vaughn. The ink flowed smoothly, sealing the end of an era and the beginning of a massive new reality. I closed the folio, setting the silver pen down beside it. The finality of the action washed over me like a sudden rush of fresh oxygen. I stood up from my desk and walked across the plush carpet toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that spanned the entire length of my office. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I rested my hand lightly against the cool glass and simply looked out at the city. For a decade, I had looked at these very same buildings through the lens of a ghost. I had manipulated numbers, hidden behind proxies, and constructed elaborate legal shields, so Andre could point out the window and claim he built the skyline. He used to stand on the balcony of our home, gripping a glass of expensive bourbon, telling his arrogant friends that he was a visionary. He told them I was just a quiet bookkeeper who did not understand the aggressive nature of commercial real estate. I looked down at the massive glass and steel high-rise located just 3 blocks away. It was the Midtown Commercial Tower, the very building where Andre had planned to move his billionaire fiancé. I owned it. I looked further north toward the affluent suburban plazas, where Chloe had desperately tried to launch her failed luxury boutiques. I owned those too. From the bustling warehouse districts to the upscale boutique hotels, the skyline did not belong to a charismatic fraud. It belonged to the quiet black woman who actually did the hard mathematical work. The realization settled deep into my soul, bringing a profound sense of total alignment. I had not just survived a toxic marriage. I had completely outgrown it. The family that had spent years treating me like a disposable scapegoat was currently experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the world without my hidden financial protection. Chloe would have to learn how to actually work for a living. She would no longer be able to use a stolen corporate credit card to command respect from waitstaff and boutique owners. Her entire identity was tied to unearned wealth, and without it, she was completely invisible to the high society circles she worshipped. Her days of looking down on women like me were permanently over. Andre was facing the terrifying machinery of the federal justice system. He would sit in cold, sterile interrogation rooms, trying to explain away years of documented embezzlement. He would no longer have an expensive legal team to bully his way out of consequences. The $30,000 I gave him would barely cover the retainer for a junior defense attorney. He would have to face a judge and a jury, as the man he truly was stripped of all his stolen armor and unearned confidence. And Victor Sterling, the ruthless managing partner who built his career on intimidating vulnerable spouses, was now operating under the strict, uncompromising oversight of JV Holdings. He knew that one wrong move, one unethical decision, or one attempt to undermine my authority would result in the immediate liquidation of his historic firm. He had become an obedient, silent employee, trapped in a financial prison of his own making. I turned away from the window and walked back to the center of my office. The space was beautiful, reflecting my own tastes and my own high standards. There were no shaved-down guest chairs. There were no psychological tricks designed to demean visitors. I did not need to manufacture power through cheap intimidation tactics because my power was entirely authentic and legally binding. I had spent my entire adult life believing that love meant shrinking myself to accommodate the insecurities of others. I thought that by fixing Andre's mistakes and funding his dreams, I was being a supportive partner. But true partnership does not require self-erasure. True love does not ask you to hide your brilliance so someone else can shine. I picked up the leather folio containing the signed divorce decree. I would have Marcus send it to the courthouse by secure courier first thing in the morning. Tomorrow, I had a massive schedule. I was meeting with a new team of ethical contractors to resume construction on the Midtown Tower. I was initiating a foundation to provide grants and financial literacy training for minority women starting their own businesses, ensuring they never had to rely on a man for capital. I was expanding JV Holdings from a shadow entity into a highly visible, recognized corporate powerhouse. I was no longer hiding behind blind trusts and anonymous proxies. I was stepping directly into the light. The journey from the quiet, disrespected wife to the undisputed architect of my own life had been forged through fire, betrayal, and absolute resilience. I had been handed a script of defeat, and I had rewritten it into a masterclass of justice. If there is one thing I have learned from watching an empire fall and rebuilding it in my own name, it is this: never underestimate the quiet ones. The loudest people in the room are usually the most fragile, relying on volume to mask their profound incompetence. But the ones who sit quietly in the background, observing, absorbing, and calculating are the ones who truly hold the power. We do not need to boast about our strength because we know exactly what we are capable of building. And more importantly, We know exactly how to tear it all down when the situation demands it. I placed the folio in my outgoing tray, took one last look around my beautiful sunlit office, and smiled. The war was officially over. The execution was perfect, irrefutable, and absolute. I picked up my purse and walked out the door, stepping confidently into a bright, beautiful future that was finally and undeniably mine. The greatest lesson from Jada's story is that you should never make yourself smaller just to protect someone else's ego. For years, Jada hid her intelligence, success, and financial strength because she believed supporting her husband meant allowing him to feel more powerful than her. But true love should never require self-erasure. A healthy partner celebrates your strength instead of benefiting from it while pretending it does not exist. Jada also learned the importance of preparation. She did not defeat betrayal through screaming, begging, or impulsive revenge. She relied on knowledge, evidence, patience, and the financial structures she had carefully built. When Andre tried to humiliate and discard her, she finally stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. Most importantly, her victory was not simply watching Andre lose everything. Her real victory was reclaiming her identity, stepping into the power she had hidden for years, and building a future where she no longer needed anyone's permission to succeed. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal is not revenge. It is refusing to sacrifice your peace, dignity, and potential ever again. If Jada's journey reminded you to never underestimate your own worth, like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.